Hello, everybody. It's Kelly. I'm back. So I hope that the guest presentations were enjoyable. I know I really like hearing from those folks. And I did explain in a previous video kind of why we do those things. It's really critical to get a lot of information about all of the different resources that are available to you on campus, including those that can help you find and build community. So now we're kind of on our last content lecture for the semester. And what we're going to talk about is presentations. So you have the presentation portion of the final project coming up. And you might have presentations in other classes for this semester, or I'm sure you will in the future for other classes. So what I want to talk about is sort of how to present effectively. And step one is don't add memes. The way that I teach and the way that I give presentations in a much more professional setting are a little bit different. So I do like to try and be cool and add memes, even if they aren't always the best. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is something called presentation management. And that's how we build the presentation and then also give it. So to start, let's look at what not to do. So what I'm going to do is give you an example of a presentation that's terrible, that I made. Terrible. And I just want you to relish in this presentation. It's pretty great. So without further ado, chemtrails, wake up sheep. Chemtrails exist? Question mark, exclamation point. What are chemtrails? Geoengineered aerosol released by planes. They contain toxic chemicals like barium 9011. Chaff looks like snow, but it's actually mylar fibers coated with aluminum. It's actually blood cells, plastic, and paper. Chemtrails have nothing to do with the jet engine combustion. They are laid out like a grid pattern and take hours to dissipate. Normal chemtrails are composed of fragile ice crystals. Chemtrails are left by planes flying lower than 30,000 feet. Contrails cannot form at lower altitudes, so these must be chemtrails. Aircraft producing contrails are constrained by FAA regulations and operate only over designated. You can read the rest, you totally get it. Chemtrails are not contrails. So why chemtrails? Well, total control of the population, government, all of these effects, real bad, real awful. Some people think that there aren't chemtrails, and they're wrong, and it's obviously the Illuminati. Chemtrails and the Illuminati. So protect yourself, stay indoors. Cilantro helps. Fulvic acid. These things. I can't pronounce them, but get them. They're helpful. Okay. So clearly, that presentation was awful, right? We can all agree that it was a terrible presentation, and no one should ever give a presentation like that. Ignoring the content, what was wrong with it? Well, some of the things that were terrible were the color choice, right? So my general rule is don't use bright yellow slides. It's really hard for people to see in a big setting. The fact that I changed my text color multiple times, not great. The fact that the text was different on every slide, the font was different on every slide and the size was different, not great. Giant blocks of text. Animations that were really distracting on every slide and every different sentence that popped up. Pictures that weren't really helpful and I never explained them. So those are some of the things that were really terrible about that presentation. And I wish I could say that I haven't seen serious presentations like that in the real world, but I definitely have. I've gone to different science, presentation forums, little different colloquiums, and some people just go crazy with the font colors and with the animations and the transitions. And it's not really helpful. So there are some cases when adding some animations to your slides have a point to serve a purpose, but sometimes they don't. So what we're going to talk about is how we can improve presentations. So keep in mind throughout all of this that the goal is to present with confidence, right? So when you're presenting with confidence, it's really good. So you want to keep your presentation clean and legible. So in that previous presentation, it was a mess, right? You couldn't read a lot of things. There were grammatical errors everywhere. So the first thing you want to do is go through and make sure that it's readable. And you want to provide the essential information. So you want to make sure that what you're putting on the slides is what's actually critical for people. Adding in some extra facts on the side is really good, but you want to make sure that anything that's going up is what people need to know. And you want to avoid distractions. So being wary of pre-made slide backgrounds. I see a lot of them on PowerPoint where it's like, oh, here, use our pretty designer template, but it's actually really distracting. Now you'll probably be like, hey, Kelly, don't you use the same pre-made University of Idaho background all the time? And the answer is yes, because that's what's encouraged when you work like for the university. It's not mandatory, but you'll also notice that like these slide backgrounds aren't very distracting. They're a neutral color. The only thing that's on them is like a slash, and the only other color is the Idaho logo in the background. So as far as pre-made ones go, it's not that bad. And I'm not saying you can't ever use pre-made slide backgrounds. There are some online, and there are some on PowerPoint that are really minimal and less distracting and look really nice. So just keep that in mind. You want to find something that's really simple. So when you're trying to present with confidence, remember that providing a strong presentation takes a lot of practice. You want to know your presentation and know your information. So that example terrible presentation I gave you, it clearly sounded like I didn't know the information. I skipped over half of the words, said I couldn't pronounce them, wasn't really confident in what information I was giving you. One of the other things you want to know is you want to really understand the requirements of the presentation. So that might be the time, the format, and the goal. So with that presentation, if I had told you that I was supposed to have a minimum of 5 minutes, did I meet that? No. I sped through that presentation really quickly. I didn't provide enough information. I didn't provide enough time for questions. I just rambled through it really fast. Maybe the format was supposed to be present on something that's has a strong body of evidence. I didn't give any sources in that presentation, and maybe the goal of the presentation was something about talk about the importance of climate control. Did I get that goal? No, not at all. So really keeping in mind what the assignment is for whatever your presentation is, or the venue, is really critical. And you want to make sure that you're knowledgeable of the technologies that you're using and create some sort of safeguards. So I've had this happen before where I went to give a presentation and it turned out that they didn't actually have a projector set up. They didn't have anything like that, or the stuff that they had wasn't working. So what do you do in those situations? And for me, I always like to have a lot of handouts and printouts with me. That way I can use those as I kind of lecture without a PowerPoint. If there's a whiteboard, I can put stuff up on that. But having some sort of handout with you when you aren't sure about technology is always a good idea. And one of the other things I like to do is save my presentations in multiple formats. So maybe I'm giving one for class and the instructor says, okay, email it to me. I'll email it to the instructor, I'll email it to myself, and I'll have it on a USB. And it might sound like I'm way over prepared for it, but it's really nice because sometimes the instructor forgets to check their email and doesn't have it or can't because they maybe forgot the thing that gets them into Duo. So making sure that I have it in multiple ways is really good. So when it comes to actually giving your presentation, one of the things you want to have is to come prepared, right? And it's whatever that looks like for you. So maybe you like having note cards or an outline or a printed out version of your slides. Whatever it is that you need in order to feel really prepared for your presentation is important. Now, some instructors might not allow certain things, right? So I know if you're in a communications class, They'll encourage you to have note cards or an outline, but not have the full printed out slides. So making sure you also understand the assignment and the sort of restrictions around what you can have. But in most cases, you're able to bring something with you to help you feel more prepared. And then when you're actually speaking, you want to take on the role of an orator. So I like to think of someone who I really enjoy listening to them talk, and I try and not copy their style, but take things from their style that I really enjoy. So I want to speak clearly. I want to make sure that I'm facing the audience, making eye contact, and dressing appropriately. So I say dress appropriately. That doesn't mean you have to be in full formal wear unless that's what's required of. But dressing up just a little bit, like making sure that your clothes don't have, you know, a giant coffee stain on them or are like really ripped up or really old, it can be nice. And if you do have any like concerns about what the dress code is, it's always good to ask. Chances are you don't have to be super fancy, but it is good to know. One of the other things that I want to mention for this is when I gave that presentation, this first one, the really awful one, I didn't speak very clearly. And that can be from a lot of reasons. Maybe I didn't know what I was talking about, or maybe I was doing slide karaoke, which you'll notice the note at the bottom says no slide karaoke. And what that is when you face the screen that your presentation's on and you just read line by line exactly what's on the slides, as if you were doing karaoke. And that isn't the most engaging presentation for multiple reasons. One, sometimes it means that you speak softly and not very clearly. Two, you're not looking at your audience. So all of that stuff that you're saying goes directly into the screen instead of out to the people. So you aren't able to make eye contact and really connect with your audience. And I know that sometimes making eye contact can be a little bit nerve-wracking, right? It can make you kind of feel anxious. So one of the things that I tell people to do is look at someone's forehead or their nose instead of their eyes, because they can't tell the difference, or look at their ear. And then make sure to kind of move eye contact around the room, and that can help reduce some of the anxiety. So you aren't just staring at one person. You're looking to the right, to the back, to the left, to the front, and just kind of like moving around the audience. Now you don't want to do this like super fast, like you're kind of looking a little haywire, a little anxious, but just kind of slowly moving in maybe like a figure 8 pattern around the room with your eyes is a really good thing to try. So one of the things that happens at the end of most presentations, and what will happen at the end of your final presentation, is questions, right? There's usually always a question section. So be prepared to answer questions and actively listen to what the question is. So it's really important to give your full attention to people when they're asking you questions on your presentation. And you can use the question to frame your response. So what that does is a couple of things. One, it shows the question asker that you were listening. And two, it gives you a little extra time to actually answer the question. So maybe you just gave a presentation on some historical topic and a person asks, so why is this person really important in the country that you're talking about? And you can kind of use that question to say like, well, Richard III is a very important historical figure for the following reasons. So those couple extra seconds might give you a little time to kind of formulate your question or your answer. Make sure to treat every question with respect. So, you know, we always talk about how there are no dumb questions, and that's really true. So you want to make sure to extend that to everybody else. Maybe someone asks a question that was very clearly in your presentation. Don't tell them that. Answer it politely. Refer back to the slide if necessary, but treat them with respect when answering that question, because maybe they just missed that little bit of information, or they might have come in late, or maybe they were trying to still remember a fact on the previous slide while you were covering this other fact. So make sure to treat those questions with respect. Sometimes you'll get people who ask a question in not a very nice way. Try and respond in a way that's polite, just to kind of keep tension low. And then make sure to thank the audience for their time. So presentations aren't really presentations without an audience. So you want to be sure to just say like, thank you all for letting me be here today. Thank you all for letting me share this information with you. Anything like that, that kind of like lets people know that you were happy to be there. Sometimes you aren't always going to be happy to be there, but still thanking the audience is a really good thing to do. So one of the other things that I want to talk about, so all of these presentation tips are kind of geared towards like a slideshow that you're giving in class, but they can also be used in the situation of a poster presentation. So I'm not sure how many of you have ever done this before, but it's really common in a lot of college fields to have poster sessions, which is where you take sort of the project or research that you've been working on, compile it into a poster, and then you have that poster up somewhere and people come by and ask questions, get some information from you on your poster. So a lot of the same tips translate into a poster session as they would in a regular presentation. So you want to make sure that the information is clear, that you have the essential information on your poster. And in the case of essential information, sometimes it's important to like bold it or put a box around it to make it really clear that that's something that you want people to pay attention to. You're going to get a lot of the same questions, right? Because people are constantly filing through, and usually there's a similar thing that folks ask. So having a really solid answer ready is important. Additionally, because poster sessions aren't like everyone sitting in a room and getting to discuss, it can be really nice to have like a business card on hand or something if someone is trying to get through the presentation but they do want to know more. So allowing them to contact you later if that's okay. Poster sessions are a really great place to network. So if you're looking at grad school or a job, this might be a place where people come to kind of see what applicants are out there. So keep that in mind and, you know, be respectful, be polite, dress professionally, and just assume that anyone there is a future contact for the work that you're doing. And if you have more questions about poster sessions, please let me know. I've done a couple of them. They're actually really fun. And I'd be happy to talk more about those. So as I said, when it comes to like a fair style or a poster session, like you're gonna have a varied audience, both in knowledge and attention. So you're gonna have some folks who are like super jazzed to be there, really know a lot about the field and wanna have an in-depth conversation. And you're also gonna have folks who maybe what you're researching isn't exactly in their field, so they might not know the same amount, and they might not stay as long as you're at your poster as at a different poster. Don't take it personally, it happens all the time, right? Like if I'm presenting on biological modeling and someone comes by and their specialty is in like modeling ecosystems, where I'm modeling like viruses, they might not be super like jazzed to read about my information. So they might just stay for a minute and then move on, and that's okay. Make sure to be prepared to repeat yourself. You're gonna give the same spiel over and over and over again. So kind of keep it interesting. Figure out what works and what doesn't as you go. So for me, the like 5-minute elevator pitch that I would give at the beginning of the poster session and the 5-minute elevator pitch I was giving at the end were very different. And that was just based on what information people seem to really hold on to, what questions I was getting. So be adaptive with that, but make sure you're still getting the critical information to folks. Bring materials with you because those can be a really good conversation starter. So maybe you weren't able to fit all of the graphs on your poster, so you have kind of a printout of some of those graphs with a summary. Make sure to bring a lot of them so that you can hand them out to folks. Make sure to put your contact info on them, and then use those as a way to get someone hooked into hearing more about your presentation or your poster. Be prepared with answers for common questions. So this happens a lot in poster sessions because you might have people of very different backgrounds. So if I'm making a poster for people in my research area, I might not need to define what a certain equation is. I can just put it up and people will get it if they're in my field. But folks who are maybe in a slightly different field won't know. So I'm going to have to be prepared to answer that question a lot. And then the big thing is focus on creating a dialogue. So a poster session is really nice in the way that you can kind of like give a really tailored presentation to every different person and make it much more conversational. So asking them what they know about it, them asking more specific questions, how it might tie into their research, those sorts of things. It can be really, really fun. It can also be kind of exhausting to have tons and tons and tons of little dialogues like that throughout the day. But they're really fun to do, I promise. So I want to end with another example, and this is an example for the final presentation. So I have this posted in the final presentation portion online, and we'll go look at that in a second. But I want to remind you of the prompt, which is for the final presentation, select a college success strategy featured in your action plan, and in your presentation, address the following. How is this strategy useful? How have you changed or improved this strategy? And how would you talk about this strategy with others? So I created a presentation for this, and it should be around 5 minutes long. It's going to be a little bit different because it's online versus when I normally give it in person for folks, so keep that in mind. But with that, I'm going to give you an example of what your final presentation could look like. Hi, everybody. My name is Kelly Christensen, and today I'm going to talk with you about critical reading for scientific articles. So it's really important to kind of muddle through really dense scientific language when you're sitting down to read an academic text. So scientific articles can be really challenging to understand just because the vocabulary can be really dense. The amount of info that they're trying to get apart or like to impart on you in 5 pages can be really, really challenging. So is there a systematic way to read these papers and make them easier to digest? And I say yes, it's all about critical reading. So in order to better understand the article you're reading, you need to read with purpose, which is something that came up when we talked about critical reading before. So I kind of adapted the critical reading strategies to fit better for scientific articles. And one thing that I learned is that you don't have to read from beginning to end to understand an article. So it's really important to change up the order of your reading. What I've noticed is that the most important information of a scientific article is located at the beginning and the end. So they open with it and they close with it. We tend to get lost in the details when we try to read straight through an article. So understanding the big picture first can help us understand the details later. And the really important thing to remember is don't be afraid to read out of order. So this is my 5-step method for how I read a scientific article. First, I read the abstract and the introduction. So in this section, they usually tell you what the purpose of the experiment was and what the general results were. So this gives me a really big picture. It'll also justify why they were doing the thing that they were doing. Then I skip to the very end and I read the conclusion. So now that I have an idea of what the point of the experiment was, I want to know what they found. So what did the researcher actually find? Then I go back and I read the background section. This gives me an idea of what previous information went into the study. So what facts were they working on? What sort of model did they use to base this on? All of that information. Then I go to the analysis because I want to dive into like, okay, what were the results? Yes, they mentioned them in the conclusion, but I want to know like, how did they find their results? what are the graphs that are important, what are the sort of relationships between different variables, all of those really nitty-gritty details of the analysis. And then finally, I go to the methods, because that's usually the most confusing portion of the paper. And this is how they did it all, right? So it might be pretty nitty-gritty when it comes down to like how they formed their experiment, what sort of methods they used. So why is this a better way to read? Well, this method contextualizes the experiments that you were trying to understand, and understanding the endpoint of an experiment can help you understand the steps that the researcher took to get there. And what I mean by that is sometimes when you know where the story is going, you can better understand the steps that the people were taking. So reading this way initially can really make a second read through easier. So what I tend to do is I read it out of order first, try and dissect that, and then a couple hours or a couple days later, I'll read it through from start to finish. And once I have that understanding of the big picture, all of those little details that you get from reading it start to finish tend to make a lot more sense. So I want to try this out with folks. I think the best way to get people to understand how to critically read a scientific article is to have you try it. So I'm going to give you a paper, and I want you to determine the following: the main goal of the experiment, the major results, and the structure of the model. And while you're doing that, I want you to read in the way that I would read it. So I'll go back to my steps so that you can kind of get a good idea of it. And we're just going to take about 2 minutes to do this. So for this portion of the presentation, I actually handed out a paper to everybody and had them try it, which satisfies the how would you share this strategy with other people? So a really good way to like talk about a strategy is to get folks to try it. So now I'd like to take any questions on scientific articles and how to read them. And I just want to thank you all for being here. And then that would be the end of the presentation, right? So pretty straightforward, not a ton of slides, and there was an activity involved. So it may not have come out to 5 minutes right away, just because presenting over computer is a lot different than presenting in person, and I fully understand that. So aim for those 5 minutes. If it's a little bit short, we'll figure something out. If you have an activity involved, make sure to really explain what you're expecting people to do during that activity. So what I want to do next is hop over to BB Learn and just talk a little bit briefly about the final project again. So if you go over to that tab, the action plan submission was done, but then you can also check out this presentation example that I still have. So it's listed there, and then one of the things that I did was I included some notes that my previous class made about this presentation. So when I gave it, I had them all grade me. I was like, okay, you know what the final project is. I want you to tell me how I should change my presentation up. So some of the things that the class said were some of the titles of the slides were too long. You could include less information per slide. You could add more visuals like pictures or charts, and include an example of how to do this. So work through an example with people, and then explain how the strategy was used by me. So they gave me an average of a B for this project. So you can kind of keep that in mind as you're using this as a template, like this would be what a B looks like as far as this presentation goes. So a couple of other things to keep in mind is on these presentations, it's okay if they're a little bit more wordy. I know that generally you don't want to include giant blocks of text, and I still don't want you to include like paragraphs of text because that's not great form for a presentation, but including a couple more bullet points than you normally would is okay, because when you're building a presentation that you're giving online, it is important to have the information written out just because you never know about connection. your mic might cut out, internet might go down, it might just be hard to hear. So having some of that information written out is actually a useful thing when you're presenting online. So a lot of my presentations for this semester have a lot more words on the slide than I would normally have, just because I'm not there to give this in person. So if you have more bullet points than you normally do, that's okay. Just make sure that they're still readable and that you're not including like a paragraph of text, because that is really rough to read regardless of how you're giving it. So when it comes to the final presentation, you're just going to email it to me. So the other thing that I want to remind folks about is if you scroll down to the final presentation scheduling, there was a Google Doc where you were supposed to select a time to present, and I still have a lot of times available. So I need people to sign up for those things, get in there and do that. I'll post a reminder about it. But with that, that is all that I have for you all today. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.